In honor of the Siyum of Masechet Eruvin, we'd like to give an BIyun shir, and we're going to focus on the beginning of the 8th perek as our Siyum, with the Mishnah on Daf Pei Beis Amud Beis, and we'll take a look at a sugya on Pei Gimel, maybe even Pei Daled. We may have to do this in sections. And I base myself to a large extent on a sefer called Torah's Refoil. I'm not sure that I always understand what he's saying. I'll try the best I can. The Mishnah tells us, and we'll take a look inside, Kama hushi uro, mazon shtei sudos. What is the shear for Erev Tchumen, the minimum amount that he has to put down to be Konik Shvitza? Mazon shtei sudos will call echad v'echad. He may be setting up the Erev Tchumen on behalf of Eruvin, Shimon, and Levi. He needs mazon shtei sudos for each one of them, so that each one of them is Konik Shvitza in the place where he has his shtei sudos. And then he can walk out of that area for 2,000 amos in each direction. Now, the Rambam in his Pirush HaMishnayos and the Bartanura here on this Mishnah both interpret that he's Konesh Shvisa, and in order to do so, he needs Mazon Shtei Sudos, which he needs for Shabbos. And the Tosas Yontif raises the following question: why is it that Shtei Sudos is enough? We know that there's a minimum requirement of 3 Sudos on Shabbos. And the Gemara Masechet Shabbos on Kuf Yutes derives this from Psukim, that the Torah requires Achila 3 times, and we need a minimum of 3 Sudos on Shabbos. Relative to Shabbos, the muzzle that he needs to be Kovesh Visa ought to be 3 Sudos. That's the question of the Tosas Yontif. And it's a very, very profound question. To answer this question and justify both the Rambam and the Bartanu's understanding that Mazon Shtei Sudos is what you need to eat for the day, and therefore that's the minimum amount but sufficient to be Konik Shvitza and set up an Erev Tchumen, we'll raise the following question. How do you define the nature of the chiyuv of sholosh sudos with regard to Shabbos? And there are 2 possibilities. We'll start with the simple possibility, which is in fact the Rambam, who codifies the halach of sholosh sudos in Perek Lamed Milchut Shabbos, together with the laws of kibud v'oneg. The Rambam has dedicated an entire chapter in Milchut Shabbos to kibud v'oneg, and when he discusses Oneg Shabbos, he formulates and codifies this requirement of 3 sudos. Clearly, the Rambam holds that the kiyum of Gimel Sudos is a kiyum of Oneg Shabbos. And from that perspective, we really understand how the increment of 1 extra Suda on Shabbos is a kiyum ha-mitzvah, because during the week, all he needs is 2 Sudos. And if he has 2 hefty meals during the course of a day, that's sufficient. And that was normal practice back in the day. On Shabbos, though, there's a new element that enters into the equation, and that's the mitzvah of Oneg Shabbos, and that requires a 3rd Suda. And that's the way the Rambam has it in Perek Lamed Milchus Shabbos. No question that the Yisodos and the nature of the chiyuv of Gimel Sudos according to the Rambam is Oneg Shabbos. And I'm thinking that from that perspective, we may have an answer already up front to the kasha of the Tosas Yontif. But before we get to that, let's just present another possible understanding of the chiyuv and the yisod of Gimel Sudos. As we said, the Gemara derives it from Achila 3 times. It could be that the nature of this takana, of this requirement of Gimel Sudos, is achilos, gimel achilos. During the course of the week, we eat 2 achilos. On Shabbos, the Torah reveals to us, and again, I don't know if it's a drasha gemura, we might call it an asmachta, that you require 3 achilos. Now, what would be the basis for redefining gimel suda, shalosh sudos, in such a way that it's not a kiyum of oneg Shabbos, but it's a machayev of 3 achilos, and achila means achila suda. My good friend Reb Chaim Ilson Shlita points out that if you look in the Sefer HaYireim of one of the Bali Atosis, Rabbi Elazar Mimetz, you will see that when he classifies mitzvos, he has them in groups. And that's very telling and revealing about the nature of a mitzvah and its essence. So, for example, he has a siman that's dedicated to those mitzvahs which he calls she'enam nasim ra lebrios ki'im lashamayim. And that group of mitzvos are what we call bein adam lamakom. And that's how he classifies it. It's not ra lebrios, it's ra l'shamayim. In any event, in that context, in Simon Tov Yud Beis, he brings down the mitzvah of 3 sudos on Shabbos. And there's another Simon, which we want to call to our attention, and that is Simon Tzadi Beis. What does he have in Simon Tzadi Beis? He has not the mitzvah of gimel sudos on Shabbos, but rather mitzvahs of achilos. And let's take, for example, the mitzvah of matzah. That would be a classic example of a mitzvah achila. In that context, and under that category, the Sefer HaYireim classifies the mitzvah of gimel seudos. That's very interesting because when he gets to Simon Tov Yud Beis of Isurim she'enam ra lebrios el ra l'shamayim, there he has the mitzvah of oneg Shabbos. You would have thought that the mitzvah of oneg Shabbos and the mitzvah of gimel seudos should be classified together, but the Sefer HaYireim goes out of its way to separate it. He's got in Simon Tzadi Beis, amongst the various mitzvahs of achila, he's got gimel seudos. And then when he talks about mitzvahs that are bein adam lemakom, that are ra l'shamayim if he doesn't fulfill them, he has on the list the mitzvah of oneg Shabbos without mentioning gimel seudos. We derive from the Sefer HaYireim in 2 ways the conclusion that he disagrees with the Rambam about the fundamental nature and the machayev of gimel seudos on Shabbos. According to the Sefer HaYireim, the mitzvah of gimel seudos is not anchored in oneg Shabbos, and the proof is that he doesn't classify gimel seudos together with oneg Shabbos in Simon Tov Yud Beis. So when he gets to Simon Tov Yud Beis and he mentions the mitzvah of oneg Shabbos, he omits the mitzvah of gimel seudos. He has instead classified the mitzvah of gimel seudos together with other mitzvahs of achila. And here we have the flip side of the coin to prove that the definition and the essence of gimel seudos, according to the Sefer HaYireim, is not oneg Shabbos, but rather achilos. Just like there's a mitzvah of achila of matzah, achilas kodshim, and you have a mitzvah of achila maybe on Sukkot, various cases of mitzvahs achila. Masechet might be a mitzvah of achila, and so forth. So within that group, he classifies gimel seudos, separating it completely from his classification later on in Simon Tov Yud Beis of mitzvahs that are ra l'shamayim, meaning oneg Shabbos. Now, before we get back to Erev Tchuvin to try to answer the question of the Tosas Yontiv, right up front, with regard to this Chakira, is Gimel Sudas an extra kiyum of Oneg Shabbos, or is it the achilos of the day? And the Torah says that the day of Shabbos, seventh day of the week, every week, generates a chiyuv of Gimel Sudos. Let's mention another few nafkaminas, leaving Erev Tchumim. We'll get right back to Erev Tchumim. For example, the Chassam Sofer has an analysis of what's called Hanos Grono versus Hanos Mea. And this is a machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish and Chulin and Yuma and many places as to what defines achila. Says the Chassam Sofer that in certain cases, even if I accept that Hanos Grono is achila, it's not going to suffice. Let's say, for example, to violate Yom Kippur, where the Torah says v'nisem, there a dry and cut mechanical ma'isa achila of Hanos Grono would not constitute a violation of Yom Kippur because it's all about Inu Nefesh. And here you need Hanos Me'av in order to violate and upset Inu Nefesh B'chayv Kores for violating the Nisam Esnafshel Seichem. And it's fascinating because in the case of Chalev, for example, if he were to eat a half a zayis of Chalev and then regurgitate it and eat the same half a zayis second time, he might be chayev malchus for eating a full kizayis, even though Hanos Me'av he didn't have. The answer is that's called a dry cut ma'isa achila that we define as achila. Suda Shabbos, says the Chassam Sofer, requires not just Hanos Grono, but Hanos Me'av. You need Svia. And the reason for that is because of Oneg Shabbos. It's not Oneg Shabbos if you chew something and then vomit it up. You need to satiate. It could be that although the Chassam Sofer is absolutely correct and his logic is persuasive and it's absolute. You can't argue it. It's totally convincing. But that's according to the Rambam and the Bar Tanura. They understood that the mitzvah of Gimel Sudos is a mitzvah of Oneg Shabbos. How can you have Oneg Shabbos without Hanos Me'av? But if you accept Rabbi Lezer Mimetz in the Sefer Yereim that the mitzvah is 3 achilos, then we could go back to our classic universal definition in Kol HaTorah Kula of what constitutes an achila. And if Hanos Grono is as a ma'isa achila, then that's enough. 3 ma'isa achilas, 3 sudos, and you are yotze. Another possible nafkamina that I thought of, again, before we get to Erev Tchumin, is whether or not you could be Mekayim this mitzvah of Gimel Sudos with a Kizayis. Could be that if we need Oneg Shabbos, maybe Kizayis, although it does constitute a Ma'isa Achila, it's not enough to achieve Oneg Shabbos. And therefore I might require Kebetza, Kedei Svia, whatever it might be. But if I go with the Sefer Yereim, that there are 3 Achilos on this day of Shabbos, then if your definition, Ein Achila P'chusa Mikazayis is a Kazayis, he ate a Kazayis, he fulfilled the mitzvah of Gimel Sudos with 3 times Kazayis. Other nafkaminas that I thought of, perhaps, would there be a difference between Tol Kedei Achilas Pras or Liachar Kedei Achilas Pras? If you're talking about a classic Ma'isa Achila, we might have to use those standards to evaluate whether you have an Achila or not. But if on the other hand you're talking about Oneg Shabbos, he wants to take his time and eat over the course of 10 minutes, spread out his Achila and his pleasure, he would have a kiyum of Oneg Shabbos. Now we get back to the kasha of the Tosas Yontif. The Tosas Yontif understood that in order to be Konesh Shvisa, you need mazon of the sudos of the day. And therefore he asks the following question, raises the objection. Bishlema, during the week, I understand that the sudos of the day are shtayim. 2 sudos is what you eat. And 1 achila, and another achila, and that's going to satiate you for the entire day. A 24-hour unit period requires nothing more than 2 achilas. But, says the Tosas Yontif, on Shabbos we have to have a 3rd achila. And therefore, mazon shtei sudos is not going to be sufficient. We need mazon shalosh sudos. Masha'en came the Rambam and the Bartanura, they understood that the halacha being kodesh visa can be generated by what we call an achila, and even on Shabbos, all I need is 2 achilos. True, I need a third suda, but that's for the kiyum of onik Shabbos. That has nothing to do with being kodesh visa. Kinyan shvisa l'chud and onik Shabbos l'chud. Through via the third achila, I'm a kind of mitzvah of onik Shabbos. But as far as how many achilos I need today on Shabbos, like any day of the week, all I need is 2 sudos, 2 achilos. And therefore, Mozon Shtei Sudas is enough. So because the Rambam holds that the third Sud of Shabbos has nothing to do with achilos, with Maisa achilos, but rather has to do with an extra kiyum of oneg, if it's irrelevant to the question of being Kodesh Visa. Kodesh Visa is a secular, mundane issue about how many achilos you need during the course of the day. 2 is enough, even on Shabbos. The Machayev of the third Suda, that comes under a different mitzvah. That's independent. That's only Shabbos. But as far as the Sefer Yereim is concerned, and if the Tosus Yontiv understood like the Yereim, that Gimel Sudas are derived from Gimel Achilos, then on this day, the 7th day of the week, I need Gimel Achilos. Hence the question, why is Mazon Shtei Sudos sufficient? And now we're ready to move on a little bit pnima into this Perek Ketzad Mishtat. Let's now fast forward to Daf Pei Gimel Amid Beis. And we have the Mishnah on Daf Pei Gimel Amid Beis. And the Mishnah says that Anshe Chotz v'Anshe Mirpeses Sheshachachu v'lo ervu kol shegavo asor tfachim lamirpeses achos mikan lachotz. We have a case of a tail, which is a mound or a pillar, and in a sense, it is accessible to both the mirpeses, they're high up above ground level, and to the ground level, the chotzer. And the question is, as far as shimush is concerned, which one of the two, whether it's the bnei hamirpeses or the bnei hachotzer, will be allowed to use this amud, this tail? On top of the tail, they can put their objects and so forth and so on. Now, if they had made an eruv between the two of them, then they become one unified rishus, and obviously this third rishus of the tail, which is accessible to both, would be swallowed up and would be covered by the eruv. But the Mishnah wants to know what happens in the event that they did not make an eruv. The Mishnah establishes that it all depends how tall is this amud. Is it more than 10 tfachim? Is it less than 10 tfachim? If it's more than 10 tfachim, then the access to this amud is more comfortable. It's more accessible to the bnei amir pesach, who are on the top level. If on the other hand it's below 10 tfachim, then it's more accessible to the bnei achotz. The Mishnah goes on to address a parallel case of chulias habar v'asela shem gvor masor tfachim. If this chulias habar, which is the outer ground that surrounds the bar is the cistern, is on the ground. If it reaches 10 tfachim, then it's more accessible to Be'er Peses, and they get the tashmish up there in the Be'er Peses. If it's less than 10 tfachim, then it's designated for the chotzer. Now the Mishnah establishes the following condition. When do we assume that if this chulya has 10 tfachim, then it's considered designated for the bnei amir peses because it's 10 tfachim high? That's only smucha. Aval mufleges afil gavoa asor tfachim. l'chutz. So we're talking about a chulya that's within close proximity of the merpeses, and it's 10 tfachim high. Ezi smucha. How do you define close proximity? Kol she'einu rechok arba tfachim merpeses. It's not more than or equal to 4 tfachim away from the merpeses. Now let's take a look at Rashi on the Mishnah. Rashi, towards the end of the Mishnah, Dibra Masel Kol Shegava Yud, says in Yesh Bachotze Tel O Amud Gava Yud. So coming up from the ground of the chutz, rising up in height, is either a tel or an amud. If it's Gava Yud and it's Samuch L'Merpeses, then Rishus Merpeses Sholetes Bo Mishtamshim Bo Mishtamshim Heim Bo Avalo Bnei Achotz. Fine. So Rashi clearly understood that this discussion about Samuch and the Bamedvar Amurim at the Sefer, the Mishnah of Bismucha, is referring to the case of Mirpeses as well. And yet, when Rashi gets down to the Sefer to interpret Bismucha, the requirement and the condition of Bismucha, Rashi says, Shachulya Smucha Limirpeses, as if he's interpreting the requirement of Smucha as relating only to the case of Chulya in the Sefer, but not to the case of Mirpeses in the Reisha, meaning the tail of the Amud. It's a bit of a pella that Rashi, Dibra Masel Smucha, only focuses our attention on Chulya, as if to say that Chulya has the requirement of Smucha Limirpeses. But that's not true, and Rashi himself admits that that's not true. So why does Rashi feel that there's an extra emphasis here with regard to Smucha on the Chulya Sabar, seemingly de-emphasizing, if you will, the case of the Tel and the Amud, which is Yud Tfachim high, and it has to be Smucha to the Merpeses? Now, what we're talking about here is what's called Tashmisho Bekosha or Tashmisho Benoach. If you have a tail or an amud that's above 10 tfachim, it's considered Tashmisho Benoach for the Bnei Merpeses on top, but only on the condition that it's Smucha. Otherwise, if they have to stretch out more than 4 tfachim, that's not considered Tashmisho Benachas. So the question we're asking is, why does Rashi emphasize the case of Chulya as far as the requirement of Smucha? In order to answer this question, we're going to raise a suffix in halacha. When we say that for example, Chulya Sabar has to be Smucha, or in the case of the Amud of the tail, it has to be Smucha, what are we saying? Are we saying that the entire tail is within Arba Tfachim of the Merpeses? What would be in a case where only part of the Amud, that part that tips towards or is proximate to the Merpeset, is within 4 Tfachim, but the rest of the Amud is outside of the area of 4 Tfachim? In other words, the Chakir is the following: is it necessary that the halach, the requirement of Smucha, has to swallow up the entire Amud, and the entire surface of the Amud is within 4 Tfachim of the Merpeses? Or is it sufficient that part of the Amud dips into that area which is within 4 Tfachim? That's enough to give me rights in the Merpeses to use the Amud, even though the rest of the Amud is outside of that area of 4 Tfachim. Perhaps logic would compel us to believe that it's enough that part of the Amud is within 4 Tfachim. That already sets up the Amud as an entity. The entire Amud has a Shem Smucha, and therefore it's considered as an extension of and designated for the Tashmish of the Bnei Hamirpeset, because the Bnei Hamirpeset, once they use part of the Amud, which is within approximate 4 Tfachim, then they use the entire Amud. So the Amud is to be viewed and defined as an entity. That would seem to be the logical way of understanding it, but how do we prove that? And perhaps the answer to that question is the case of Chulias Habar. In Chulias Habar, we have a proof, perhaps, that it's sufficient to have smucha in part of the Amud tail, or in this case, the Chulias Habar. How is that so? And the answer is the following. Although, again, I can't prove anything, as I said, from tail and Amud, but I could prove myself from the case of Chulias Habar. Why? Logically, it must be that part of the Chulias Habar is within Dalet Tfachim in its proximity to the Mirpeses. Why? When we deal with Chulias Habar, we're dealing not just with the Chulia, but with the bar itself as well. And that we see clearly from the Gemara on Daf Pei Dalet Amud Aleph, and Tosfos there, Dibra Maskil Hachinami, that the Mishnah is talking about integrating the bar subterranean with the Chulia that's above ground in order to establish whether or not we have a het attachment to use the bar itself inside the bar. Now, the bar itself, we're going to try to prove, has to have a minimum width of 4 tfachim. Less than 4 tfachim won't do. Why? Though this is based on the previous perek and the statement, the shita and ruling of Shmuel on Daf Ayin Vav Amud Beis going on to Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph. What happens over there? This is the beginning of a perek that's called Chalon, and we have a case of 2 chatzeros with a window in between, and if the window has certain dimensions, it's above 10 tfachim, and it has 4 by 4 tfachim in width, then we consider the 2 chatzeros to be one, and one erev is enough. And we have a similar case in a bar v'chulyaso that's located between 2 chatzeros. Now, if you take a look at the Gemara on Daf Ayin Vav Amud Beis, we will see the statement of Rav. Let's open up to Ayin Vav Amud Beis for just a moment. Oh, perfect. We have it. The Gemara says that Ein bo arba mai. We have a case of, for example, a wall between 2 chatzeros, and the issue is whether or not you can carry on each side of the wall from the chatzer up to the top of the wall. On top of the wall, you're allowed to carry. That's a Rishus HaYochid. It has a height of Asar Tfachim and a width of Dalet Tfachim. So within one part of the wall and the other, on the top, it's all Rishus HaYochid. That's mutter. But with regard to taking it from the chatzer up to the top, that's prohibited, because the Rabbanan made a gzeira that if you take something from a chatzer into a Rishus HaYochid, and this Rishus HaYochid is accessible to 2 chatzeros, you must have an erev. However, what happens, the Gemara wants to know, if on top the chatzer is less than arba? Rav says, Avir shtei reshuyos sholtos bo liyozis bo afilu nema. The reason why you can't carry on top is because unless you have an erev chatzeros, you have an avir of shtei reshuyos. Each of the 2 chatzeros has access to the avir on top, and osro zuelzu. When you have an area that is accessible and it relates to 2 reshuyos, 2 chatzeros, then you must have an area. Then we turn to Daf Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph, and Rabbi Yochanan Omar, Elu malim mikan v'yochlin, and elu malim mikan v'yochlin. That there's no Easter here to take from the chotzer up to the top of the wall. And why? Despite the fact that the wall may have a height, but it doesn't have a width of dalet al dalet tfachim. Rashi explains it's a makom p'tur, and you're allowed to carry from Rishus HaYachid to a makom p'tur. Therefore, each one of the bnei chatzeros on both sides of the wall are allowed to carry it on top, all because it's less than arba tfachim. Now, when we talk about bar b'chul yaso, if that bar is situated between two chatzeros, and the question is which one of the chatzeros has closer access, if it's equally distant to both of them, they both have access, then otzro su el su. But again, Rabbi Yochanan is going to insist that that's only if the bar has 4 tfachim. If it doesn't have the width of 4 tfachim, then it becomes a makom tur, and then the halacha that otzro su el su could not possibly apply, as we saw in the case of the wall. So just like in the wall that doesn't have 4 by 4 tfachim on top, each one of the bnei chatzeros is allowed to carry up on top. So too, if you have a bar that's less than 4 tfachim in width, then each one of the two bnei chatzeros on the two sides of this bar would be allowed to have access to the bar and draw water from the bar, etc., because it's a makom tur. Therefore, by definition, when we're talking in the Mishnah here at the beginning of Perek Ketzad Mishtatfim on Daf Pei Gimel and Beis about a bar, v'chul yaso, the bar itself has to have a minimum of 4 tfachim. Otherwise, there's no reason in the world why Rabbi Yochanan would deny that you can carry and draw water from the bar, because if it's less than 4 tfachim, it becomes a makom tur. It's completely batel u'mavutal, and each side can use it freely. Now, if we add the chulya on top, the chulya is on the sfasa bar, around the bar on top, on the ground space. So that means that the chulya is more than 4 tfachim by definition. Now, what we have is a case of bar v'chul yaso smucha. Smucha means it's within 4 tfachim. Well, what's within 4 tfachim? It can't be that the entire bar is within 4 tfachim, because if the bar itself is 4 tfachim, and the chulya around the bar is an additional whatever distance or whatever thickness, call it a mashu, but whatever it is, it goes beyond arba tfachim, then quite clearly we have a proof now to our original question. Is it necessary for the entire bar, or in the Resha, in the case of an amud or a tail, to be totally within 4 tfachim? So Rashi quotes the case of chulya bar v'chul yaso b'dibra maskel smucha in order to illustrate that smucha means that it's got to be somewhere, one part of it within the daled tfachim. But clearly, the balance of the bar has to be, or some part of the bar has to be outside of daled tfachim. So this is what Rashi perhaps wants to prove to us, that we view the entire amud, tail, or bar as one entity, and if part of it dips into the proximity of 4 tfachim, that's enough to be matir. And it's called smucha, again, assuming you have the 10 tfachim height, and therefore the bnei ha'aliyah, or what we call the bnei ha'mirpeses, will have a total access to use the amud, the tail, the bar, even though it's not all within daled amos. That's what Rashi wants to drive home. Okay, then, this is the first half of our Siyum for Masechet Eruvin, and Mitzvah Shem. We hope to conclude this Siyum in a very short amount of time.